So hello everyone, it's fantastic to see the room packed out, and I think there are people downstairs watching who couldn't fit into the room, and I'm not surprised. I'm Chief Executive of the RSA, Matthew Taylor. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's event. Could you make sure your mobile phone is not going to make a noise, but leave it on so that you can tweet? The hashtag is RSA Soulful, S-O-U-L-F-U-L, or RSA Soulful, if you want to get involved in the discussion on Twitter. Now, it is my enormous pleasure to introduce today's guest speaker. Frederic Laloux is an advisor, coach and facilitator for leaders who want to explore fundamentally new ways of organising. And when I say fundamentally, I mean fundamentally. A former associate partner with McKinsey & Company. Feel free to boo. No, don't. Frederic's groundbreaking research in the field of emerging organisational models has been described as world-changing by some of the most respected scholars in the field of human development. He joins us today to share a small fraction of the insights from his recent book, Reinventing Organisations. And I can just tell you about this book that not only do I have a copy at home, which is very well thumbed, but when I read it, I bought it for the whole of the executive team at the RSA. So all my executive team colleagues have also read it, and we've spent a lot of time talking about it and how we might apply it in our practice. And we'll talk a bit about how kind of intimidating it can sometimes be to think about the distance you have to travel and how you might be able to do that. So it's been a really powerful book for me, and copies are available outside. I hope you'll get one if you haven't read it already. So Frederic's going to speak for about 20 minutes. I'm going to ask him 2 or 3 questions, and then we're going to open up to you. And I've said to Frederic, I really hope it's going to be a really challenging session, because he's going to say some radical stuff. So feel free to say, I don't believe it. You can cope with that, can't you? Absolutely. Okay, so please join me in welcoming Frederic Laloux.
Really special room to be in. I want to do something special, which I haven't done before. A sort of check-in, because I imagine, you've had already a busy day, probably a busier day than I had. And for us to really be present here, I just want to invite you to listen silently for 10 seconds. Just how do you feel? Is there anything that needs to be named? Any distractions, any thoughts, so that you can put them aside. And then maybe just, once you've done this 10 seconds, share that with a neighbor and get it out of the system, and then we can be fully present and start. How does that sound? Strange, right? So that's my invitation. 10-second silence, what's playing for you? What possibly prevents you from really being there and fully enjoying this? And then turn to a neighbor. And just quickly share it, and then we'll get going. Okay, are you guys more or less done? Good. I realize I didn't have anyone to share it with somebody. I feel cheeky for having tried this. I feel really happy, and I'm quite excited to be here. And so, let's go. I will briefly take 20 minutes to talk about, the main findings from the research I've done, and then hopefully we'll have a good discussion, good debate. at the end of the 17th century, calculus was invented, right? And calculus has meant a leap forward for science and really for humanity as a whole. And what I've always found extraordinary about that discovery is that it wasn't just one person who discovered calculus. There were actually several, Newton and Leibniz, most famously, but also de Fermat and a few others, who, at the same time, independently of each other, discovered calculus. And it's really rather extraordinary because for 100,000 years of human history, no one bothered. And then it was as if there was something in the air that made humanity ready for that leap. And I believe there's something in the air today that makes us ready for a leap in the field of management, in the field of organizations. For the last 3 years, I've been doing in-depth research into truly pioneering organizations that have been founded by people, or at some point had a new CEO who had a very deep conviction that the current way to think about management, the current way to run organizations, is outdated. It wasn't working for them. And they did something quite extravagant, which is that they decided to pretty much throw out everything we're being told in business school about the way we should run organizations, and then went on a mad journey of innovation, to try to replace it with something that they hoped would be more powerful, more soulful, more purposeful. And what got me really excited when I started this research is to discover that even though they didn't know of each other, they worked independently, like Newton and Leibniz, what they ended up with was often remarkably similar, even though they worked in very different industries, very different geographies, and also really meant a leap in terms of management. And so I think there's something in the air that lots of different people are catching for the moment that is, making us ready for really a momentous leap in terms of management. Now, it's a grand claim, and grand claim, I think, rightly, invites skepticism. Is it really possible to believe that we can make a leap in terms of management? Isn't that just wishful thinking? I think it helps to, quickly have a look back in history. Humanity in its evolution has gone through a number of fundamental leaps, a number of very distinct ages. And when you look at it closely, at every time we've made a leap from one age to another, we've also invented a radically more powerful way to come together in organizations, a radically more powerful organizational model. Right? The very first organizations of the tribal age were very crude, violent, pretty unstable affairs. And then came a fundamental breakthrough in the agrarian age, which was the org chart. The box and the job title, job description, and a stable reporting line, and that just reduced the levels of violence dramatically and allowed organizations to scale and to achieve things that were unthinkable before. Right? Or take the next leap when we went to the scientific industrial age. That's when the notion of innovation came up, the notion of progress. Right? The idea that it's by innovating that we create value, and if we innovate faster than competitors, we can gain market share, was only born at that moment. And that unlocked the unprecedented prosperity that we've enjoyed in large parts of the world in the last 200 years. Right? So, we have in the past had a number of these major leaps in the way we come together in organizations. And so it's not unthinkable at all, I believe, that we might be about to make a leap. It would just be one more leap, basically on the human journey. And actually, it's not a theoretical possibility. There are organizations out there that I researched that are already operating to a significant degree from the next stage. It's already happening. Let me tell you the story of one of these organizations called Buurtzorg. It's a remarkable organization in the Netherlands active in home care. So nurses that don't work in a hospital, that go to people's homes to take care of people in their own home. And in the 1980s, nurses that mostly worked independently were pushed by the social security system to regroup in organizations. And then the whole traditional management thinking took over. And that traditional management thinking, we all know it, really pushed for cost cutting, to squeeze out any possible efficiency from the system. And in that way, in many ways, it was very successful. It generated cost savings for the social security. But it also had a shadow side. There's something deeply, dispiriting, dehumanizing about how these organizations ended up with. Imagine you're a nurse in one of these traditional nursing organizations. Every evening you receive a sheet of paper made by someone in a planning department that you don't know, somewhere in headquarters, that tells you what your next day looks like. And it goes something like this. At 8 o'clock in the morning, you're supposed to start with this old lady that you've never met to change your compression stocking. And the compression stocking, time norm 2.5 minutes. So in, hey, stocking out by, it's 8 or 2.5. And then the system calculated, Google Maps, that it takes 4 minutes to drive up to the next patient. So at 8:06.5, you're at the next patient and you're making a shot, and that's exactly 10 minutes. So at 8:16.5, you're out, and we know that because you have to scan a barcode that's affixed on the front door of all these patients, so that centrally, we can monitor where exactly you might be losing a minute or gaining in a minute. And then you have, 7 minutes to drive up to the next patient, and that's how your day looks like. And the result of that is that clients and nurses hate the system. Clients hate the system because, imagine you're one of these, say, old ladies, and every day there's a different nurse that comes in that you don't know, that is hurried, that looks at the paper, oh, sure, you need a shot, okay, and then, you say, well, that's what it says on paper, but it's a little bit more complicated, let me explain. And then the nurse says, yeah, I'd love to listen, but I don't have time, and runs out of the door again. Right? And the nurses hate the system because they know very often that they're doing bad care, but there's nothing else they can do because they've been transformed into these sort of robots of care. And I think it's an apt metaphor of where today's management tends to lead us. And in the middle of that landscape comes a man called Jos de Blok, who's for a very long time been one of these neighborhood nurses. And at some point, he was just tired of it and decided to create his own organization called Buurtzorg. And he wanted to build it on entirely different foundations. And he started with the question of purpose. And for him, the purpose of Buurtzorg is not to administer shots or change bandages. It is really to help patients lead the richest and most autonomous lives that they can. And so if you're a nurse at Buurtzorg, you sit down and drink coffee with your patients and ask them questions and inquire, what is it that you like to do? What is it that you can still do? What is it that you no longer can do? How could we help you with this? Is there a network of support around you? Oh, your children live in town, but you don't get along with them very well. Do you think it might be a good idea if we make a little family meeting and I'm happy to mediate? I've seen that there's a young family next door. Do you think I could ring and just ask them if they would like to be introduced so that you have somebody to fall back on if you need help? The level of care that happens at Buurtzorg is extraordinary. It's the same 1 or 2 nurses that sometimes work for years with these clients, sometimes up to terminal care. And the result of that is that clients and nurses love it. So much so that Buurtzorg today went from 4 nurses in 2007 when it was created to 9,000 today. And they have more than 80% of all neighborhood nurses in the Netherlands working for them. They went basically from 0 to 80% market share, simply because all the nurses and all the clients are deserting traditional employers and just throwing themselves at Buurtzorg and saying, can we please work with you? And what I find even more extraordinary is that from a medical and from a financial point of view, it's incredibly successful too. Because the first reaction, maybe it was your reaction, is to say, yeah, come on, it's easy to do good care if you have time to sit down and drink coffee and make family reunions. But we're trying to squeeze every minute out of the system, right? And what an Ernst & Young report found was that Buurtzorg uses less than 40% of the hours that doctors prescribe because patients become autonomous so much faster. And so it's a total paradox compared to the guys who are really trying to squeeze every minute. Buurtzorg is actually saving the Dutch state hundreds of millions of euros every year because they're so much more effective. And that's the kind of results you can get when you operate from the next stage of management. Because the nurses are exactly the same nurses than in traditional organization. The only thing that sets Buurtzorg apart is how they are organized internally, is their management model. So how do organizations like Buurtzorg and some others that operate from this next level, how do they work from the inside? Well, according to my research, there are 3 fundamental breakthroughs as compared to today's management. And the first one is self-management. In Buurtzorg, with 9,000 people, there isn't a single manager. There are no levels of hierarchy. There's no pyramid. And there are other organizations of a few hundred, a few thousand people that operate entirely without the traditional boss-subordinate relationship. What they've done is that they've replaced all of that with much more powerful systems of distributed authority, of collective intelligence, that are, by the way, remarkably similar to some of the systems that we find in complex ecosystems in nature. They've cracked the code to import that into organizations. Right? And to do that, they have had to not only get rid of stuff, but then they had to reinvent other stuff. Right? It's not just getting rid of hierarchy. So they've had to pretty much redefine all of the basic building blocks of management. If it's not the pyramid, it must be another structure. They had to reinvent the decision-making mechanisms. They've had to deal with everyday questions that every organization deals with, like how do we do when somebody is underperforming? What happens? Who makes how much money at the end of the year? Is always a tricky question. And so they've had to adapt or basically upgrade these systems for systems of distributive authority. And what's fascinating is that there's enough Buurtzorgs out there today for us to actually know in very pragmatic detail how these things work. We know now how these building blocks work for organizations to operate on these more powerful foundations. And what happens is extraordinary because instead of having just a few powerful people at the top, suddenly everyone in the organization is powerful. And that just changes everything. Now, second breakthrough has to do with wholeness. In today's organizations, we're pushed to show up with a very narrow part of ourselves, to show up wearing a professional mask. And sometimes we've worn it for so long that we don't even realize that we're wearing that mask. Right? Let me try and illustrate that. In many organizations, we come to see that it's actually okay to show up from the ego. It's actually okay to fight for our careers, for promotion, to fight for our unit, our department. But it's very risky stuff to come from a deeper place. Right? There's something in us all that longs to take good care of others, that longs to take good care of the planet. And yet there's so often things that we somehow need to do, whether we're working in education, in healthcare, in banking, in advertising, that somehow hurts our soul, that hurts our conscience. But we feel it would be very risky to speak up. It feels like it could be career limiting. And so I think we've all made the experience. We might have forgotten about it because we want to forget about it, but I think we've all made the experience at some point of putting a lid on some of the things that matter most to us. And I think if we end up playing so often so many petty ego games in organizations, it's because we no longer have access to stuff that actually really matters to us because we've put a lid on it. It's the same story for the fact that we all have a masculine and a feminine energy, whether we're a man or a woman. And we quickly learned that in most organizations, showing up masculine, determined, no doubts, if there's a mistake, it's somebody else's mistakes, and let's look forward, not to back. That is valued. Showing up from a more feminine presence, showing up from a more caring side, wanting to slow down, asking questions, daring to be vulnerable, that is not a career winner. And so we all show up, men and women, much more masculine than we otherwise would, and hide our doubts, our feeling. And we all have a rational and intuitive and emotional, spiritual side. And the rational, that's great. Facts and figures in organizations, that's great. Intuitive, emotional, no emotions in organizations, please. And spirit, no spirit, right? And we end up with this. And what some of the organizations I researched have understood at a very profound level is that if so many organizations today feel somewhat lifeless, it's because we bring so little life into the organization. And so they've put in place a great number, again, of practices, often very beautiful, soulful practices that help us open up that window and dare to drop the mask and show up in the full glory of our humanity. And there's enormous energy, enormous creativity that gets freed when we finally drop the mask. There's something in us that is just incredibly joyful and grateful when we can be ourselves. And these organizations are very mindful and conscious about that. And the third breakthrough is one I call evolutionary purpose. The whole management paradigm today is predicated upon the notion of predict and control. Right? The smartest people in organizations, the one at the top, need to predict the future, right? To have a very clever strategy. And then we need to control everything that happens in the organization to make sure that that's where we're going, right? And we have a whole arsenal of management tools to control that, right? We have strategic planning, and we have midterm planning, and we have yearly budget cycles, and we have balanced scorecards and KPIs and targets and objectives and incentives, predict and control. And what leaders of some of these organizations, like Joseph de Block, say is, predict and control might have made sense, but the world has become way too complex. And actually, we don't need to predict and control. We can do something that is much simpler and yet much more powerful, which is sense and respond. Which is, instead of predicting where the organization wants to go, let's trust that the organization is a living organism, that the organization has a sense of direction of its own, has a creative genius of its own, has something it's called to manifest in the world. And so from a much more humble place, let us all listen where this organization is wanting to go, and then let's dance with it to get there. Let's constantly sense and respond to where it wants to go. And that makes everything incredibly simple, and things seem to happen to fall into place because you're constantly, sailing with the wind. You're not trying to force a course which isn't a natural course. You're actually going where things want to go naturally. And again, there's a whole host of things that we feel we need to do today that almost disappear or get replaced with something easier and more powerful. How we do strategy and planning and budgets and targets and performance management. And again, for pretty much all of these, we now know, in very practical terms, how these things work. So to sum up, I believe there's something in the air that a lot of different people are catching for the moment. And there's some truly pioneering organizations out there that already operate from the next stage. And there's enough of them for us to actually know how this works, for us to actually know how these building blocks work. And so my invitation to you is that, next time that you're frustrated at work, and whether your work is in a business, a non-profit, a school, or hospital, next time you're frustrated at work, because you sit in endless meetings, or you're tired of the politics, or the infighting, or the bureaucracy, or whatever it is, you remember, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. There are pioneers out there who show us it's possible to run organizations in ways that are really radically more powerful, soulful, and purposeful than what we do today. Thanks, and
So I've chaired about 100 lectures, more, 150 since I've been running the RSA, and I have to say I think that's, of all of them, one of the ones that's just most inspiring and challenging to listen to. And maybe that's just because I run the organisation. So, two or three questions from me before we open it up. One of the interesting things about the book, can I be brutally honest with you here, is that when I recommend the book to people who I think are going to be kind of skeptical, I do kind of say to them, you don't need to read the first couple of chapters.
That's good.
Because,
straight to the essence.
Yeah, because the first couple of chapters, which I enjoyed, but they're quite theoretical and they're around notions of human development. And I'm interested in, because you didn't talk much about that in your presentation, which is very kind of you to stick to your time, allotted time, but how important is it, do you think, to have that underlying theory of human development, higher stages of human development, to the practice that you've described? Do you need to have the theory, or can you just, as it were, have the practice?
Yeah, so for those of you that haven't read the book, the first part you're referring to tells a story of these past levels of the tribal organizations and the agrarian organizations, and the reason I include that in the book, and very much understand that some people are not interested in that and want to go straight to what are these new organizations look like. But the reason I thought it was important to include that was that I sense that many of us sense that something isn't working with the way we do organizations today and long for something more, but we don't know if we can trust that instinct. And we fear that we might be called fools or idealists for wanting to think. And so I think for me it was important to show that background, simply to say, we've had a number of these fundamental transitions. And so if you sense deep inside, if you feel called to experiment with something, a lot of people around you are going to call you crazy, are going to say that what you do is risky. And I hope this will give you some, reassurance that you're not just, a pot-smoking hippie that is just dreaming of a better world. That there are actually really good reasons to believe that we're just engaging in something new.
But it also doesn't link, Frederic, to the notion that you wouldn't embark upon this practice if you had a more narrow, more economistic view of human nature.
Yes, so I think it is, the kind of CEO that, would want to do this, I think has, for instance, to have his ego pretty well under control.
That's tough for me. I've been trying for so long.
But there's a... Did you feel that was meant for you?
I'm just speaking for the room,
You see, there's one thing that many of these leaders say is there's something that feels like giving up control, right? You know, in a good old pyramid, if you're the CEO, you feel like you have a lot of control, right? You can't be an autocratic leader. You can just impose things, and you know you have all these staff functions that work for you. And then they say, hey, but if I go to a self-managing organization, I will lose all that control, right? And that obviously feels risky. And what pretty much all of them say in almost the same terms is, I've come to realize that before that, I had a lot of illusion of control. Because you know, people were telling me all sorts of stuff I wanted to hear, and you know, I wasn't really aware of many things that were going on and stuff. And now, you know, there's power and control in the system. Right? The system, you know, has all sorts of, like in a living system, has all sorts of antibodies that kick in, and I don't need to be the one that piles pressure onto the whole thing. But before they realize that, they have to give up that control. And that, you know, takes somebody whose ego is pretty much in control because it feels fearful. And so indeed, you know, if you're, you know, a more mechanistic leader, you know, more, you know, purely achievement-oriented leader, you know, that's the kind of last thing you would want to do. So it takes a, you know, Jos de Blok was here recently, and you've seen the man, and he embodies these qualities quite marvelously. You know, when he says that he trusts people, it's not just something he says. He deeply trusts them, and he trusts himself that, you know, if there's a reason not to trust them anymore, he will have that conversation. And, you know.
Two more questions from me before I open it out, and they're kind of related, I think. So the first one is that, how possible is it to, and there will be many people sitting in the room watching this or who've read the book and who will want, as I do, have a kind of visceral feeling as a leader or somebody who works with leaders or somebody who just wants to change the organisation they work in, a visceral attraction to this kind of story and its humanity. But their question will be, can I get there slowly? Or is this like moving from driving on the left to driving on the right gradually, ends in a car crash in the middle of the road? So. And you know, it's interesting because when we talked before we came in, I said this, and maybe I wasn't sure that I got it right, and it's interesting that I got this message. Maybe it's a self-serving message, but from the book, I kind of got a story which is, you know, it's all or nothing. You know, you either kind of plunge into this or you don't, and if you stand on the edge, dipping your feet in, it's not going to come out well. So, was I right to get that impression?
I sometimes get a feeling that I should have been clear in the book. I say it a few times, but I should have said it many more times, that, for instance, not all of the organizations are equally advanced on the three breakthroughs. An organization like Buurtzorg is pretty advanced in all three, but there is, for instance, Morningstar, amazing organization that does processed tomatoes and makes ketchup, you know, 50% of all the ketchup in the world, kind of, you know. And they're incredibly advanced in terms of self-management, but not at all in the other two dimensions, right? And so, while they reinforce each other, you don't necessarily need to advance on all fronts. And often when people ask me this question, it is really related to the piece of self-management, because that's the scary piece, right? The piece, you know, if you really go all the way to, you know, remove management hierarchy as we know it. Because you know, all the practice on wholeness, you can introduce them gradually the way you want. And at some point with management, it is, you can't be half pregnant. At some point, you have to decide that you do. But in the meantime, there's lots of steps that you can do. And that will turn you into a fabulous organization, even with remnants of hierarchy, right? I think many people in the room might be familiar with SEMCO, you know, an organization in Brazil. You know, there was a book about it in the 90s that was a huge bestseller. And for a long time, SEMCO was revered, and they still had remnants of hierarchy. But what they did, just to name a few things, is, you know, to name any manager, you know, traditionally it's the boss who names his direct reports. In this case, it's people below that write a job description for their bosses and then interview people and decide on their boss. Right? If you do that, if you add to the mix that salaries are determined in peer-based processes, it's no longer the boss that decides the salary. If you decide to use the advice process, which is a mechanism for kind of non-hierarchical decision-making, you know, you might still have remnants of hierarchy, but in effect, you know, the poison that might be in this, you know, power relationship is actually drained from the system, and you can get extraordinary results. And I've just had a discussion with a great publicly in the French word, so a government-owned organization. And they said, the politicians on our board will never let us, get rid of hierarchy, and that's just not feasible. And so we decided, hey, this is the road to go for you, right? Have people elect their own bosses, have people decide on salaries in a peer-based fashion, introduce the advice process. And probably the board is going to be fine with that, and you'll be a fantastic organization, right? And you still have remnants of hierarchy in place, and that's okay.
And so final question, which is, one of the issues I have with kind of a lot of the literature around human development is the implication that you, as it were, can reach a higher level of consciousness at which inherent conflicts within our nature as human beings, within organisations, are kind of dispelled and never to return because we've kind of transcended them. And I'm suspicious of that notion. I kind of take a more kind of a quasi-Freudian view of the fact that there is just inherent conflict within our makeup as human beings. I'm interested in how your theory relates to notions of conflict and complexity and chaos even, and how it is that organisations cope with that in what can sometimes feel almost like a kind of utopian vision of people all in the same direction, reaching a kind of collective nirvana.
I mean, there's lots of conflicts happening in these organizations too, because conflict is just part of being in a group together as human beings, right? We all have our own shadows, and in relationship to others, some of those shadows show up, and we have conflict. In many ways, I think we should have more rather than less conflict. I think in today's organization, we have a lot of conflict for the ego. I think we should have more conflicts for the soul. So I think we should have lots of conflicts. What you see is that, in these stages, we have better and better mechanisms to deal with them that are less and less destructive. Right? And sometimes some of these systems can break down. The Roman Empire broke down, and we can fall back. There's an image I use in the book. In many values-driven organizations today that still have hierarchy, they spend a huge amount of training dollars on trying to have managers become coaches and serving leaders rather than autocratic managers, right? Helping people deal with power gracefully. And that is great, but I obviously believe that the better step is not to have power hierarchy at all, because then you don't have this dysfunctionality. And the image I used is, imagine, distributing guns to kids in kindergarten, right? And then teaching them all not to use their guns. Wouldn't it be better not to give them guns in the first place, right? And then the American editor came in and said, that's a charged debate in the US. So I took out that image. But so there's just, better and more graceful ways to deal with conflict.
Great, thank you. Okay, so let's take the gentleman here with the beard first.
Thanks.
Could you tell us your name? That'd be great.
Sure. My name's Stuart Turnbull. Frederic, I guess like me, you probably have some.
Can you show me where is it? Oh,
you probably have some intelligent clients who get what you're talking about and then say, "I haven't got time."
I haven't come across that. I would just say, well, fine then. You're probably not ready. I mean.
Can I recast the question slightly, which is to say, how do you change while continuing to do what you have to do in a world where you can't really afford to kind of close down for 6 months and reinvent yourself? You've got to carry on making tomatoes, looking after people as the same. I mean, the thing that Jos had, which you don't have if you run, the RSA or whatever it might be, is, he started small with those principles, and then he grew the principles as he grew the organisation. But if you're an existing organisation, you've got lots of functionality. You've got to maintain that functionality while changing. Is that yeah?
And there are some of the organizations that I looked at that were traditional organizations. At some point, had a new CEO and then changed. And I've really come to believe that there is no one path to get there. There's every road leads to Rome, and a lot of it has to do with, of course, the specificity of that organization, the industry they're in, and but also just the the personality of the CEO and of the board, because in today's pyramid, the CEO is still, so important. And what I've noticed is this can go really quite fast. If there are CEOs who just say, hey, I've suddenly understood that there's so many things about the current system that I don't like, that I'm just going to do it, and we'll blunder our way, into making this happen. One of the interesting discussions that comes back a lot for the moment is organizations that want to go about it in a change management perspective, which I've come to understand is really from the old world. They want to plan everything perfectly. They want to have the perfect plan to get there. And ideally, it's so well thought out that it will be absolutely painless. That they think, if I've done the greatest plan, it will be painless, and everyone at the end will come out and say, I haven't even noticed. Right? And I believe, these systems are so complex that it's impossible to plan. I think the only thing you can do is say, where do I have most energy now? Whatever it is, hey, the budget process is a pain. Let's take that out and redo it a different way, whatever it is. And maybe have an idea for one more step or two more steps. But actually what we constantly need to do is listen. Because as soon as we change something, something in the system will scream. Some people will not be happy. Right? I've taken that out. Hey, you've taken this lever out, but you're still expecting me to deliver results. This is unfair. Oh, okay, so we need to change the way we do targets. And then you change targets, and then, but something, right? And so it's a whole different, I think, change management approach, which is let's do what we can do right now with the time we have, with the energy we have, and then let's listen very carefully, and then let's do the next step. And let's tell everyone that there is really, hopefully, something much better out there at the end, and it will be painful in the middle. Part of it will be painful is because, so many of us have power in some ways that we will have to exercise in different ways. There's old shadows that were baked into the system that everybody had lived with that, are going to come out. So there's lots of stuff that's going to happen.
We have the person over there. I can only actually see your hair and the fact that you've got a pink fluorescence on your T-shirt. So, there we are.
My T-shirt. Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, my T-shirt is unimportant. I'm Peter Cook. Following on from your question, my question's about the head and not the soul. If we assume that organisations have heads, heart and souls, much of my work with organisation is spending time bedeviling the head, critical success factors, key performance measures, objectives, balanced scorecards, unbalanced scorecards and everything else. Do we need to create more balance in organisations by having a new type of CEO, in other words, the Chief Emotional Officer? And would Matthew like to be its first member?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are some people advocating we need a Chief Spiritual Officer and a Chief Happiness Officer and stuff.
That all sounds a bit creepy, though, doesn't it, really?
Yes. I mean, the poor Chief Happiness Officer, when he has a bad day, I mean, what does he... to me, that all feels like add-ons in many ways that, can allow the system to continue the way it does. I think we need to try to engage everyone at a deeper level, right? And so, just to give you an example, almost all of these organizations have decided they needed different meeting techniques. Simply because meetings are places where we naturally tend to come from the head and we naturally come from the ego, because right in front of our colleagues and maybe a boss, we don't want to look stupid and we want to win arguments. And so we need to have some practices that ground us and help us to come from a deeper place. And so you don't need to achieve something, we all need to do it. And there's some very simple, beautiful practices. You might have seen me share this. There's one network of German hospitals called Heiligenfeld, and I love their thing. Every meeting room has a pair of these Asian hand symbols. You might know them, these things you do like ding, and then they make an awfully long ding sound, right? And anyone in these organizations, every time you have a meeting, the first question is, who will, take the bells? And the role of that person is simply to ring the bells if ever he or she has a feeling that someone out as part of the group, or he or himself or herself, speaks from the ego. Has switched to wanting to be right for the sake of wanting to be right. And then goes like ding! And then the practice is that everyone stays silent for kind of the minute that it takes and just inquires into who am I serving right now? Am I serving my ego or am I serving something larger? And they found that the practice has helped them have meetings without ego. I mean, how extraordinary is that, right? Meetings without ego. They barely, don't need to use them anymore. And they've told me that most of the time somebody just reaches for them, and people go like, "Oh yeah, okay, you're right?" And I think it's extraordinary. I mean, I've had, been part of many executive team meetings in larger banks and stuff where if that had existed, the only person to speak would have been the bells, right? Ding, 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 ding. Right? So, we really have to reinvent ways to relate to, with each other from a different place rather than outsourcing that to achieve something, in my opinion.
I just realised why sometimes when I arrive at work, the fire alarm goes off. There's someone there. Yep.
Oh, hello. I'm Paquita de Zureta. I'm a GP. Could you please come and talk to NHS England? No, seriously. Seriously, I mean, I've already been promoting your ideas, but you see, one of the problems is that the chief honchos, the managers, they look threatened because it's not just they're going to have to lose control, they will have to lose their jobs. And so we're up against this.
I mean, it's true. I mean, the extreme example of that is Buurtzorg. 9,000 people. I don't think they have a single MBA. There isn't, something like, top manager. There's, and so it can feel threatening. I've just had a delightful evening in the Netherlands last week with an entrepreneur who now runs 3 hospitals. And he is really charged up with the idea that he wants to prove that we're crazy to keep merging hospitals. I don't know if it's the same in England, it's the case in Europe, to ever bigger structures, because we believe that we have economies of scale. We completely forget that we have huge diseconomies of motivation, of bureaucracy, etc. And he wants to prove that you can actually break down a hospital into small, very agile, self-managing units. I mean, for God's sake, they're all highly trained doctors and nurses that have done years of study. I mean, these people know what they do. Let's just trust them and let's put in place clever mechanism so that if ever something wrong happens, it becomes apparent and they can self-correct it. And we've spent most of the evening, so they're fully determined to go there, and we've spent most of the evening discussing how can you deal with the regulation. And I can imagine it's the same in the UK, is that every time something goes wrong in a hospital, somebody in some ministry feels they have to make a new regulation to prevent this from ever happening again, right? And so actually the hospital is tied in to systems in all sorts of ways, and so the whole question is how can you free yourself or work within that system of regulation? And you can, but it's difficult. And I think we just need to work with those people who are ready for it, rather than fighting the system. Let's work with those few people who are really ready for it, show that it works, and then just become the sort of common attractor, kind of Buurtzorg style, where everybody at some point will just clamor and say, hey, come on.
Because just put your hands down for a second. Because there are so many hands and so little time. What I'm going to ask you to do is, if this is all right with you, Frederic, I'm going to ask people to just make short comments or very short questions, and we'll try and do a whole cluster, and then just pick 2 or 3 at the end. I mean, which doesn't mean any disrespect to those you can't answer, but just pick 2 or 3 because we do need to finish on time. So please, if your comment is long and complex or your question, then don't ask it, so that we can just get around as many people as possible. Yeah, short, sharp points. Okay.
So focusing in on the stand-up, focusing on self-management. In your book, you give 2 options about taking a pre-packaged option like Holacracy off the shelf to do self-management, or taking a pick-and-mix option of picking various practices of self-management and doing it yourself. And I understand you've since done a Holacracy training. What would you say about people who are going to make the choice about moving towards self-management, about whether to do an off-the-shelf thing like Holacracy or a more pick-and-mix option?
Okay, pass the microphone back to Julian.
Hi. What happens to the likes of McKinsey in your new world?
Very good. I'm looking for more women who want to ask questions, but very good. There you are. Excellent.
I'd just like to some thoughts of yours around scarcity and abundance, because the old worldview was very much based on scarcity. We had quite recently a person who gave a talk here, I can't remember his name, from Jerusalem, on what makes us uniquely human, like the imagination, adaptability, flexibility that no other species has. And that somehow triggers me around the concept of abundance. If I could have some thoughts on that.
Okay, at the back of the room, there's a gentleman there. Two more after this.
Could you tell us your personal story about how you came to write this book? It's a very spiritual book, it seems to me, from a McKinsey's consultant.
Okay, we'll take a couple of people in the front row here, and in a moment I'm going to make myself incredibly unpopular, but these two here.
Yeah, just a quickie. I couldn't help but think of a murmuration. So formation, incredibly complex, thousands and thousands, sometimes millions of birds, but all just with a very small number of rules. Right? You picked out one particular example that quite affected you with the symbols. If you only had to pick out two others that had the biggest effect in terms of flying and formation, what would they be?
And then finally, because these are really good questions that deserve answers.
Brendan Martin, you've talked about self-management, but you didn't talk about teamwork. And what struck me about Buurtzorg is that it's based on self-managed teams. I wonder if you could say a bit more about that.
I'm so sorry for all the people I haven't called, but the book is available outside. All questions are answered within its covers. Can I ask you one question to add to all of that list? No, just this, we've got a general election in a few months' time. And one of the things I find interesting about the political debate in general elections is organisations aren't talked about as a political phenomenon. That is to say, we talk about society and how good it is, and our politicians talk about organisations as black boxes. There are inputs and there are outputs. Do you think we need to be politicising the conversation about organisations in terms of the health of society as a whole? So, pick any of those and ignore mine if you want to.
Very quick answer. Off the shelf or make your own mix. Sense and respond. Sense what's right for your organization. By the way, that's the answer I give to 50% of the questions is sense from within what is the right thing. On birds flying in formation, one thing I haven't talked about, but at each of these stages of organizations, there was a very clear dominant metaphor for how a good organization should operate. Right? In the tribal age, it's a wolf pack, and you have to have an alpha wolf that keeps the others in control. Right? The current dominant paradigm is organizations are machines, right? And people are cogs, and we redesign organizations, and we pull levers, and we have the whole engineering language. And what is absolutely striking is how almost all of the people in these new kind of organizations use a different type of metaphor, which is metaphors taken from nature, from living systems. And actually, it's very close to what in science, people look at, complex adaptive systems. We just realize that nature is just so complex and there's so much we can learn from that. And by the way, nature is incredibly abundant, and suddenly we can, learn that we don't need to think in terms of scarcity. And so yes, one way you can look at this whole thing is just saying, what are the 2-3 building blocks I can start with? And that's enough. And then we'll stumble upon problems and something will shout and we'll adapt that. And for instance, one, for me, critical building block in self-management is the advice process, right? We've grown up to believe that there's fundamentally only 2 ways to make decisions. Either it's hierarchical, top-down, or it's consensus. And we know that both of them have advantages, but also big, drawbacks. Top-down, at least we make a decision, but it involves all sorts of politics, and the leader might not know what's going on in the field and make wrong decisions. Consensus sounds great in principle, but if you've been part of a large group trying to make consensus, you probably hate it. And so, what I found, which is amazing, is that all of the self-managing organizations operate with a third mechanism, simply because these two cannot accommodate. So they've had to invent something. That was, again, one of these things that was just in the air, because it's remarkably similar in many cases. And the principle is the following, and then you can do it in different ways, but is that anyone can make any decision, provided they have thought input from people who have expertise and for people who will have to live with the consequences. And if you do that, you no longer need meetings to have approval. You don't need to have things that escalate. You no longer need to make PowerPoints, right? And if it's a small decision, you probably don't need to consult anyone. And if it's somewhat larger, you just speak to one or two people. You pop into, If it's a larger one, then there's mechanisms to do that as a team. Let me tell you how Jos de Blok does it. I think, and it brings us back to this no ego kind of thing. Jos de Blok often has to make decisions that affect now 9,000 nurses. And he can't make them in an autocratic manner. He has to consult them for advice. By the way, at the end of it, you don't need to make a watered-down compromise. You've listened to everyone. You made a process of collective intelligence in your own head. And you said, I've listened to you. Sorry, for that and that reason, I've really listened, but I'm not taking your thing into account. So Jos de Blok needs to talk to 9,000 people. How does he do that? He can't literally walk in. He's found a very simple way that works for him. He writes a blog post, and he does that from his sofa at 10 o'clock in the evening at home. And he says, hey, we have a problem with, how we calculate overhours. And here's what I think we should do. And he types it, and poof, he sends it out full of typos. It doesn't go through communication department. And then, because he's very respected, by the next day, 24 hours later, 80% of all nurses will have read it. And depending on the topic, a few dozens to a few hundreds will have written comments. And so 24 hours later, he has a snapshot. And basically one of two things happen. Most of the time, most nurses say, hey, yeah, sounds good, great idea. And the decision is taken 24 hours later. Incredible, right? 24-hour decision-making mechanism. And sometimes, and this has happened too, he receives a very public slap in his face, where nurses say, are you kidding us? That is such a bad idea. You obviously are too far removed from the field. And what Jos de Blok then does, 24 hours later, when he's back in his sofa at 10 o'clock, he goes oops. Right? So obviously it's more complex than I thought, and here's the counter-proposal. Or maybe he says it's so complex, who wants to be part of a voluntary task force to look into the matter? And that's a kind of egolessness that you need of just simply saying, oops, but he has no problem with it. What I love about that story and that simple rule that you were saying, like birds flying information, is look how much simpler this is. I like to think how this would have happened in a traditional organization. Jos de Blok, for over hours, would have asked his head of HR to come up with something. The head of HR would have probably told someone junior in HR to work it out. That junior person would have worked out, probably ask a colleague for help before he throws it to the head of HR again because it's his boss. Then meeting with the head of HR wants corrections, it goes back to HR, finally goes to the executive committee. And then the head of HR has an enemy that doesn't want him to have an easy victory, and so, pokes up the other things, right? And then it goes back, and it goes to the executive committee second time, it gets approved. Then it goes to somebody in communications department that crafts a very nice and gives a nice spin. And then it's cascaded through managers to everyone. How much time, is tied up in that process compared to one blog post, right? When, so that's the kind of, simple things. So for me, the advice process, if you want to go to self-management, so some decision-making mechanism that doesn't involve, and by the way, you can do that while keeping the hierarchy. And so you just don't need to defer to your boss. You ask your boss for advice and possibly say to your boss, I've really listened, but for these reasons, I've decided to go against you.
Frederic, we're running out of time.
I'm too enthusiastic about it.
Thank you for that. I've been pushing the book for the last hour, but I'll push it again. It is a fantastic book, and it's available outside. And I know, because I was listening hard, that many of the questions that you weren't able to answer, including my own, but I'm fine about that, are addressed in the book. Frederic, it's been a magical hour that you have spent with us. Please join me in thanking Frederic Laloux.